All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Tryon Palace Live. I'm Hadley Cheris, and today we are talking about the gardens of Tryon Palace. If you have any questions throughout, please post them in the comments, and I will answer them at the end. This is part of our What's Growing Wednesday. If you didn't see our lovely little video from yesterday, giving you a little bit of inside scoop, I will have to give you the sad news that if you are not in New Bern and not aware of our weather, I did not get my regularly scheduled weather, so we're inside today, but we hope to be outside come the next time we do this. So hoping that you all are enjoying nicer weather than we are here, but we wanted to give you guys a little scoop on kind of what goes on behind the palace in the event that you haven't seen it lately, and give you a little bit of history of how some of our gardens have changed for those of you who may have visited when you were younger or a lot younger. And give you a little update on what's going on and kind of how we do what we do. So I am the Gardens and Greenhouse Manager here at Tryon Palace, and just wanted to kind of give you an idea. All right, so we will get started. So to give you kind of an idea of how much we've changed over time, this is actually the beginning of the palace reconstruction in 1955. You can see in this photo that we've got some of the buildings kind of started, but by and large it looks very much like kind of a downtown with a weird semicircle in the middle. So this is what we started with in the 50s when they were. This had been a really long, for a long time that they've been working on. So as we progress, you can see that even our aerial shots have changed. So the one that's the black and white photo on the left is actually what we have had as one of our older images. This is approximately the 1960s, early 1960s, as things are very, very small. You can tell that our wilderness gardens especially, those are very much planted, but very full of tiny little trees. And so then a more recent picture that's going to be in about 2013. So that red dot is actually on our History Center, which we added in about 2010. So the site's changed a lot over time, and we wanted to just kind of give you a viewpoint for those of you who may not know how much our gardens have changed over time. So one of the big people who was really influential in this was Morley Williams. He came to the palace as part of the rebuilding of the palace itself. He was a landscape architect who had worked at many other historic sites. And he was originally contracted as part of the architecture team. He did a lot of the work, as you may have heard his name in the past, on kind of the archaeology of the palace, some of those early things to discover what we were learning about the palace, what might have been left over. But so he had previously worked at several other historic sites. He had a lot of experience in garden design, especially the style that's very prominent in this time period. So in the 1950s, that's going to be colonial revival. More or less, this is meaning that they're inspired by colonial influences, but realistically, as we kind of look back at it now, it's very much kind of that post-World War II, make everything bright and new and shiny and beautiful and just kind of over the top. So with a lot of our gardens, that's really important to remember, is that they are doing this post-World War II. Things are meant to be big and grand and beautiful, but as we have kind of learned over time, that's not necessarily where we would have been in Governor Tryon's time. So what we know about the site as far as the gardens, we've done a lot of archaeology over many, many years. We've really never found anything that confirms things. So we actually have two maps, the Sautier map and the Miranda map. So the Sautier map is the map that you see with that little C and H on it. Most of the gardens in that map are actually on the front side of the palace. And then the Miranda map is the map that has most of those gardens on the back or the river side of the palace. So one of the big things to note with this is that we're going to kind of talk about, as we go through each of the gardens, what is taken from each kind of map. But the big thing is that they did not actually have access to the Miranda map in the 1950s and 1960s when they were rebuilding it. They knew it existed, but they were not able to get it because, unfortunately, at the time, being from a little itsy-bitsy state in a relatively itsy-bitsy town of New Bern, did not bear much weight on sending a snail mail message to Venezuela to say, hey guys, we'd like a copy of your map. So we actually ended up with that map in the 1990s. And so we have kind of looked at it over time, but we don't have concrete evidence that either one of these maps is actually what would have been at the time of the palace. The one thing we do know for sure is that they would have grown cabbage. We know this because when Governor Josiah Martin was here, they actually talk about him hiding gunpowder under the cabbage. So that is the only documented plant that we know existed on the palace grounds at the governor's time in the 1770s and 1780s. So, one of the big questions we always get a lot about, I'm going to go ahead and hit this one up front, is the Grand Allée. When they built the palace in the rebuilt the palace in the 1950s and 60s, they did this. It was very, very much based off of kind of that vision of grandeur that they were going for, that colonial revival style. You'll see this kind of style in some other sites, but one of the big things to note is that, as you can see in that little map, this is the Miranda map, which they did not have. So while the Grand Allée very much matches what we have on the Miranda map, it did not exist at the same time period that they were rebuilding the palace. And so there are a lot of people, I know I've been at the palace for about 7 years now, and I constantly get questions about when we're going to redo a Grand Allée, and I will have to tell you, everybody loved the oaks, and I totally respect the shade, but we've gone back in our own records and found that from one day to the next, there were a lot of kind of back and forth between the commission members at the time and Morley Williams as to what they should plant. He said they should plant boxwoods. They said how many? He said, I don't know. They said, okay, no. He said we should plant evergreen, some kind of conical thing. They said how many? He said, we'll see. I got to get you a budget estimate on that. Nothing happened. And so the allée was actually planted with oaks in about 1960. There's no record of why they chose oaks. It was not on their original list of things that could have been planted. While oaks are a native species to North Carolina, we actually assume that the reason they planted oaks is because they could get them large, and it was what was available at the time period. They knew that they needed to have a very big dramatic effect when they opened the palace. So that black and white photo in the upper corner is what was there in 1960s when they opened. As you go kind of counterclockwise, that is the palace front avenue in about the 1990s. It gives you kind of an idea. It was very much a great shade space, but what a lot of people don't realize is that the Grand Allée that you see now was dramatically smaller. It was the same distance to the front of the, as the front gate entrance. And then you see the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that at the same time that we had the Grand Allée, we also had a stoplight. So that was part of really what was there at the time. In 2004, as part of a TDA project, they actually redid the whole of that. So if you've seen the front of our area now, you know that that is cobblestone and stop signs. So a lot of things changed as they did that. That was part of their kind of push to have a more historic entrance from the street into it. And as part of that, because the oaks were actually dying, they had lived past the extent of their lifespan and were diseased, they took it out. So that photo you see in the bottom corner is going to be from 2004. So a lot of people don't realize it has already been 16 years since all the oaks came out. At that point in time, because we were having so many large events, they actually expanded the alley to what you see today. So it's actually somewhere between 3 to 4 times as wide of that marl path section, which is another daunting thing of why we do not put oaks back in, because we don't have the same soil composite that we do. So over time, you can see how that's really changed the entrance, but just something to note that you'll get a lot of kind of back and forth discussion about this, but the oaks were definitely not a historical, from everything we've been able to find, the oaks were not a historical choice, and this is not actually something that was proven out one way or another by either any archaeology or any evidence they had at the time when they built the palace. So a couple other things to kind of give you an idea. This is the Green Garden. For those of you who may have visited it more recently and kind of gone, don't get the name, it is actually named because at one point in time it was green. As you can see in that top left corner, that's what it looked like kind of from the point of building it in the 70s, 60s and 70s up until about 2000 when they removed those hedges. Part of that was because hedges are an extremely high maintenance sort of thing, and while green is a lovely color, you know, there are a few other colors that we can play with in the rainbow while still respecting green. So you can see kind of its metamorphosis over time going clockwise. That next photo is as it changed in 2010. It was still mostly green, but had a lot of more perennial plants, things that bloom throughout the year. And then as we move onwards onto 2016 and 2018, those lower two pictures, those are actually it as we continue to change it. So we are making a point, as you can kind of tell from each of those pictures, it is designed as what's called a knot garden. So it's that very intricate detail. So we've made a big push over the last couple of years to really make that more symmetrical than it had been in previous years. But just to give you an idea, we are always constantly changing it. As far as the map goes, you see this kind of style of garden. As you look at that center black and white drawing, this is the Miranda map again. And so this is actually similar to what the has laid out, but those gardens that are laid out on either side of the palace in the Miranda map would have been food production gardens, so kitchen gardens. So this is one of those gardens laid out on the side of the palace, but technically not as what it would have been. So the Latham Garden, our kind of crown jewel, a lot of people don't realize how much the Latham Garden has changed over time. So in the upper corner, you get to see very much bare, completely just soil with the very beginnings of brick edging. One of the big things that they struggled with when they were building the palace grounds in the 1950s and 60s was that they had a lot of drainage issues, which they did not really expect. And so many of the gardens were redone multiple times. The Latham Garden is one of those that a lot of times we get questions about, well, this is meant to be like a British garden, so why do you have certain plants in here? Why don't you have other plants in here? And the Latham Garden is a perfect example. So those lower two, both the middle and the other picture, are really great examples of why we don't grow certain things. They actually had to replant the Latham Garden about 3 times because they were not able to grow the plants they thought they were going to grow. So they tried to have hedges of Santolina and germander at first. Those died because it gets really hot here and they cannot grow consistently enough to form hedges. Over time, you'll see that they were always kind of doing that colonial inspiration style, as you can see from the lower pictures. We've always used those as a seasonal display garden. So this is a big thing in colonial revival garden design, is that you want color. And sometimes, for lack of a better term, it's kind of like vomiting up color upon things because you really want a high concentration of color. But just to give you an idea, you can really see the contrast in those hedge materials as we go on to more current pictures. So as we change, you can tell even more recently, these pictures are from approximately the late 80s to modern day. The left side is going to be the 80s and 90s. So they've messed with a lot of plant material over time. We tend to cycle through so that all of our gardens that are seasonal display gardens go through tulips and violas, and then summer annuals of varying forms and fashion. And then we go to mums as part of our quick fall display before cycling back to violas and tulips underplanted. You can tell there's been a vast array of colors. Some of those went really well. You can see that picture in the bottom, the yellow and purple kind of exploded over the sides of the hedges. So we have really had to learn over time what plants can work well and what plants cannot. The Latham Garden is also interesting because we grow two different kinds of hedges in there. So the majority of our center hedges are dwarf Yaupon hollies, Ilex vomitoria, and then our outside hedges are that boxwood. So for us, we really find that boxwood is not a great long-term plant for here because it's way too hot. And so dwarf Yaupon hollies are a lot more tolerant of kind of brutal heat, brutal humidity, and occasionally, we got a lot of school groups, brutal children who like to see this as the maze and run and jump. So sorry, little kids, I know that's fun. Please don't do it. As we go onwards, this is the Hawk's Alley. If you have not made it all the way out the back of the Latham, that's where this garden is located. And the Hawk's Alley is actually named for John Hawkes, who was the original architect of the palace. And so these statues that you see on four sides represent the four seasons. They were given by DuPont family members who were actually ancestors of his. So the four on the sides, 2 and 2, are the four seasons, and then at the end it's a terracotta statue who is her own. She is not an extra season. We didn't, build an extra season in there just for her. But this garden's really changed a lot over time. So as you can see in that top left picture, it started as a lot of the gardens that the palace did, with hedges, very high color displays. They actually used to bed out the whole of the Latham, which I cannot imagine, but they had a lot more gardeners than we do now. And so over time, we've kind of transitioned that. As you go counterclockwise, you see in the lower corner with those purples, those are Salvia leucanthus. So they went through kind of big, clumpy perennials over time. And then as you go to the top corner, that's about 2014 as what we were at. We had a lot of really kind of, in an effort to kind of mimic the old style of the niches around the statues, they had used arborvitaes. If you have arborvitaes, I'm very sorry for you. For us, we had a lot of issues with bagworms, and it got to the point that it was not worth picking off all of the bagworms, and all of the things you can spray for bagworms are very, very bad for pollinators, which matters especially to me, as you will probably find out more as we go on if you did not already know. So over time, we decided, because it was unrealistic to maintain that garden and we'd gotten kind of iffy with what was happening, that we would go to our last phase, which is in that lower corner with the yellow. So in about 2015, 2016, we started modifying the garden to become a pollinator prairie, because it seemed just a little poetically fun to have a very formal statuary with a very informal garden. So the term pollinator prairie is kind of loosely used to mean an area that is mostly going to be perennials with a couple of textural elements to hold it in. We had a lot of these plants already kind of starting with the black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers, and then we added approximately, I'd say somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 pounds worth of seed over 2 years in that area. The other thing that we really did in here, and if you haven't heard me get on my soapbox about this, I'm very sorry, and here you go now. But we also added 25 pounds worth of clover into our lawn there. So you can see over time some of that patchiness had occurred because we don't have the same amount of staff or the same amount of lawn maintenance budget that we had in the 50s. And so we went to clover to kind of overseed with our grass. And last year, when we had those 6 weeks of drought, this was actually the only lawn that stayed remotely green, and it was not super high watered. So for us, that's a big victory because we are constantly concerned with those kind of year-long approaches. Even though in our own home gardens, we may be able to get away with things kind of being sad because of drought, that's not the palace way. So we really have to be careful about that. A couple other things, people really don't realize how many of the gardens in the palace have changed over time. So this is the Pleat Gelee. On the left side, you'll see at one point in time, the Pleat Gelee was actually made of red buds. So this is the original iteration of the Pleat Gelee that they built in the 60s. It explained to us, many of us didn't actually know this because we'd never seen the pictures of it, why we have so many redbuds on site up until Hurricane Florence. And so they were actually training these redbuds to grow over type of that kind of scope. And so it would have been trimmed to stay very nice and tight to that. If you have redbud trees, you know that that's not very practical long term, and this is another one of those areas because of the drainage where they actually had to remove everything to redo some of the issues that were happening in the Latham and the Hawks, as well as the wilderness. So it went over time to a regular Yopon holly, which is why we make a point to say dwarf Yopon holly in the Latham. So regular Yopon holly is a native. It grows very, very well. It's easy to shear. And so over the last probably 5 years, we've been working on rejuvenation pruning. You can see in that top corner picture that it actually had gotten very tall. Part of the idea of a Pleat Gelee is that you're maintaining it very tightly. So over time, we actually had a volunteer arborist come in and help us go through the process of actually taking out all of the big things. So if you walk through the Pleat Gelee, you can actually see pretty sizable stumps left underneath. But we did it over that amount of time because this is also a really popular area for our brides to do that lovely dappled sunlight photo, and we didn't want to just go naked in that area so that there wouldn't be any kind of dappled sunlight for their photos. So we have completed that. It still gets regular maintenance every year. We're continuing to train new things into it, but that's something that really has kind of altered over time. So the wilderness garden is by far the thing that most people don't know how different it is. So if you look at some of these pictures, the black and whites are all of the early years of the palace, kind of that first decade or so from the late 50s to the late 60s. You'll see in these pictures, actually half of the wilderness was built out of fill dirt. I've heard it somewhere in the neck of 18 feet worth of fill dirt. So, as you can see in that picture of the South Lawn, at one point in time, it was actually mostly flat. If you've been on our South Lawn lately, it is not. We actually have a fairly substantial kind of mounded hill at the back of it because that fill dirt has sunk over time. The wilderness by far was one of their huge issues where they had a ton of drainage problems. I think the wilderness has probably been replanted more than any other garden at the palace. They brought in several professors from NC State to deal with the soil implications and all of that. But one of the big things